Hey, welcome back to our professional development webinar series. Today we are joined by Dr. Timothy O'Malley, who's going to be talking with us about the theology of marriage, how it can offer healing medicine for those seeking love in the hookup culture. This series is all about helping you create vibrant parishes and growing ministries. It's helping you with professional development, formation, training, and the tools that you need to create those vibrant Catholic parishes and growing ministries. I'm Jared I'm the content marketing manager at Ave Maria Press, and I'm here with Aaron Pierce, who's the parish and curriculum marketing specialist.
Before we begin our webinar, we'd like to recognize our webinar partners, the National Conference for Catechetical Leadership, the National Association of Catholic Family Life Ministers, the National Association for Lay Ministry, and the National Federation of Priests' Councils.
So before we start, I want to say that everyone in the audience is muted, but you can ask questions, and questions may be sent to the presenter using the question section of the GoToWebinar panel, which you can see displayed on your screen here. I'd also like to note that we are recording this webinar, and we'll send a link out of the recording to you later on this week via email, so watch your inboxes.
With that, I would like to extend a very warm welcome to our presenter. Tim O'Malley is a Catholic theologian, author, speaker, and managing director of the McGrath Institute for Church Life at the University of Notre Dame. Tim, welcome, and thank you for being with us today.
Oh, thanks so much for having me.
All right, Tim, I'm going to make you the presenter, so look for a pop-up to pull up the recording of your screen.
Great.
It looks good.
Great. Well, hello everyone. Thanks so much for being here. It's a joy to be able to present a bit on my recent book, Off the Hook, which was published with Ave Maria Press. I want to begin with sort of what the book. Today we're going to deal with. Well, what does the book deal with? Sort of concretely, what's the topic? What do we mean by a hookup culture? And then we want to move into some ways that the sacrament of marriage can actually be healing of this culture. All right. Oh, there we go. So I want to begin kind of with my own relationship of love, my own marriage, and that, early in our relationships, we tend to sort of survive on the context of myths of love, what we think love is, even if we actually get it wrong. And for my spouse and I, we're both graduates of the University of Notre Dame, and we graduated with the sense that nearly everything would go well in our lives. You know, that marriage was the beginning of the happiest of the happy days. And sure, there might be some trouble down the road. One of us might get sick in the long term, but sort of immediate trouble was not to be found. And we were married. We lived in South Bend for a couple of years, and then we moved almost immediately to Boston, where I was completing my doctorate at Boston College. And things were difficult. The doctoral program I was in wasn't perfect. I actually sort of found myself kind of wondering whether I should be doing a doctorate at all. My wife loved her job in some ways, but hated it in others. And this was the first time she was really in a job where she thought, man, I don't like this much. And then we began trying to start our own family and to have children, and we weren't able to. So these were things that sort of assembled together to construct one of our myths of love that, you know, after marriage was this perfect sort of movement of upward mobility. I always remember how important a certain phrase, a certain sort of scripture was at this moment of my life from St. Paul's letter to the Romans. In fact, it's one of the options for the ritual of marriage for the sacrament. I urge you, therefore, brothers and sisters, by the mercies of God, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God, your spiritual worship. Do not conform yourselves to this age, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and pleasing and perfect. This sense, I came to realize that my myth of love was founded not upon the gospel, as I previously thought, but by dealing really with the reality of suffering of marriage. Not that my marriage was suffering, but the suffering that came in the context of marriage. I came to discover that actually something more. It was this self-sacrificial love, a love radically to the end. This was what I had to learn. Well, friends, today Another myth is alive, and it doesn't pertain so much to the myth of upward mobility, although that actually exists too. But one of the myths that many of my undergraduates deal with, I teach a course with 150 undergraduates per semester at Notre Dame called Nuptial Mystery on the Sacrament of Marriage, is they deal with the hookup. When I talk to people, they always say, well, what's the hookup, right? Everyone has always, in the history of the world, premarital sex has always been something that people have dealt with. Well, the hookup is different than just premarital sex or even lots of premarital sex. The hookup is a radical fear of communion and communication. And so there's a book that I reference in my own, Donna Friedis's The End of Sex, which writes, for all intents and purposes, the hookup has replaced the first date on campus. When you encounter college couples today, chances are they got into their serial committed relationship through hookup. This also means it's likely they had sex before they went out on a date or had a serious conversation about their feelings for each other. And it almost certainly means that the couple engaged in many drunken encounters before ever becoming sexually intimate while sober. In this culture, the sex comes first, then openness and communication, but only much later. The hookup is something that happens amongst young adults today, although in fact it's moving beyond young adulthood, where rather than begin a relationship through conversation, through dancing, through going out on a date, the first relationship that unfolds is sexual. It's some sort of encounter of a sort of sexual union that, well, to be frank, is often without sort of deep meaning. It's without communion. It's without communication. And then only later do they actually talk to one another. In a lot of the sociological or cultural analysis literature that you can read around the hookup, it's something like this. Yeah, we had sex, but it's too intimate to actually figure out if we're dating each other. So what you have is a radical fear of communion. And where does this come from? I think you can think about three things. I want to sort of first talk about Tinder. Tinder is an online dating app, and it's an app that you use to sort of swipe left or swipe right. I can never remember which way you swipe when you like someone, but you look at their image and you basically swipe left or you swipe right. Tinder has no information on it about the human being that you're actually trying to encounter. It is functionally just an image. It's a pure encounter with an avatar, something that we look like and we say, well, actually, I'm interested in you based upon how you look. And so what there is a kind of fear of communion. Tinder is designed for short-term encounters. Often in cities, for example, in bars, you'll use Tinder as a way of sort of calling someone in the bar. Everyone will be on their phone looking at the bar to figure out if there's someone there that they could hook up with that evening. And so you have a fear of communion that emerges with this, a fear of a real intimacy. It's one thing to look at an avatar of someone with perfect duck lips doing a selfie, and another to have an actual encounter with a human being who you realize along the way spits when they talk and maybe doesn't look the same as they do after they took 35 different selfies. This is linked, I think, more widely to the iPhone. Or the Google phone or whatever phone you have. This phone has mediated communion and communication. I want you to think about, if you've ever been married yourself or experienced marriage or talked to married couples, that often the very first encounter is an encounter that's mediated face to face. It's a physical, living, breathing encounter. Yet the iPhone, the phone, has taken away this sort of sense of intimacy. You know, many of my undergraduates are afraid to come into office hours. They're afraid to communicate with me face to face. They're so used to this communion that exists over the phone, like my own phone, which is right here. They're so used to this communion that they don't actually think to themselves about what it means to communicate with someone face to face. The sphere of communion is deepened even more, lastly, by pornography. If you think about the endemic of pornography amongst our culture, I estimate that amongst 8,000 undergraduates at Notre Dame, if you think about half are men, roughly today, 1,500 to 2,000 Notre Dame undergraduates have looked at pornography today. That's a stunning number. And the endemic of pornography forms us to expect that male-female relationships, or really any relationship, is oriented first and foremost to sex. And this is the kind of sex that sort of that comes with no cost, that has no sort of emotional register to it. And so a kind of cultural script or narrative develops amongst many of these young people to assume that marriage begins, love begins through sex. These three things are parts of the hookup culture. And the thing is not everyone hooks up. In a recent book by Jason King on the sort of Catholic hookup culture, he estimates that only 20% of Catholic students at any Catholic college would be involved in hooking up. But I think this is to sort of, this is to recognize, well, first of all, that's kind of good news. It means that when people say that everyone is hooking up, they don't mean that. It's really 1 in 5 people at Notre Dame who might be involved in hookup culture. But hookup culture is more than just the act of hooking up, it's culture. So I write in my book, even those who do not participate in the hookup culture are still affected by the cheapening of sex in this dating market. Think about dating as a kind of market. I know that sounds crass, but think about it as a market where everybody's paying attention to everything else. This is what this costs, this is normal, this is how I behave. And so in a hookup culture, where the primary cultural script is that sex precedes intimacy, it precedes communion, then the assumption becomes that even if you don't want to participate, that there's something wrong with you. So these people grow up watching television and films in which it's normative for young, attractive men and women to engage in sex soon after meeting. They hear about friends who've participated in drunken hookups and who've parlayed such hookups into long-term relationships. And when they go out on a date, it's likely that a person on the other side of the table expects easy access to sex early in the date. A friend of mine recently heard on a date, we don't have to have sex on the third date. This was to comfort her. She intended on not having sex on the third date, but he comforted her and said we could do it just a bit later. This assumption affects love, and it affects a sort of capacity to love, because many of us just assume that something is wrong with our capacity to love if it doesn't follow this cultural script. And so I often have undergraduates write about this in my class. They'll say, I reject the hookup culture, I don't like it, but they often have to develop countercultural practices against this culture, which include things like long-term dating, staying in and watching movies, hanging out with religious people who don't want to be involved in this. They have to set up sort of parameters by which not to be involved in this culture. So I want to talk then a little bit about why the sacrament of marriage could be a medicine for this. And this does not seem intuitive. In the last 17 years in Roman Catholicism, we've had a 17% drop in those participating in the sacrament of marriage. But one of the things I've discovered, both at talks and Newman centers, and in parish ministry, and in my own classroom, is how much students want to talk about love. My class on the sacrament of marriage has 150 students in it, and that's because I limit it to 150. It could be 200 or 250. And so why talk about something like a sacrament, a ritual, a practice of marriage that can form our imagination as a medicine against the hookup culture? Well, I rely on the work of James K.A. Smith, who's actually a philosopher at Calvin College, who writes a good deal about practice. He notes love is a habit. This means that our love is like second nature. It directs and propels us, often under the radar of conscious awareness, like breathing and blinking. It means that our loves acquire direction and orientation because we're immersed over time in practices and rituals that affectively and viscerally train our desires. So the healing of hookup culture isn't just going to be an example of saying, okay, I don't want to do it anymore, and this is why I shouldn't. It's not just receiving from elders, priests, religious who are preaching on something like this, don't do this. Actually, it requires developing new habits, a new form of life, a new imagination to see what is possible in love. And the sacrament of marriage offers in the church this kind of confluence, this place where all these dimensions of practice come together. I want to talk about some aspects of this medicine that sort of help run through my book, but do a little bit more than that and even advance its argument. So the first practice is philosophy. Now, I know what you're saying to me, if you're actually sort of listening and sort of talking to your screen right now. You're saying, who understands philosophy as a practice? Philosophy is that thing where you determine whether your chair exists, or whether your phone exists, or whether I exist, right? It's that kind of annoying subject you take in college. But what if philosophy is something more? In ancient philosophy, philosophy was a kind of way of life. It was a practice, a way of thinking about something. The way that we sort of think about the world shapes the way that we act in the world. So for example, as a driver who once lived in Boston, I look at the world as a place where every human being at every moment is trying to basically competitively race me in the car. if in order to develop a sort of new understanding of what driving would be, I would need a philosophy and a new understanding of the human person that would change that. So it's true with love. Many of the undergraduates I speak to, and in fact, more than undergraduates, many people I speak to in parishes, have a very sort of strange understanding of what love comes from, a new understanding. That love is passion, it's romance, it's constant love of the other person. In a really interesting book, Eva Allou's Consuming the Romantic Utopia, Love and the Cultural Contradictions of Capitalism, she writes, marriage today, the new marriage, attempted to integrate therapeutic discourse. In other words, how do we form ourselves to complete ourselves, to enter into compatibility and perfect compatibility with each other? So it borrowed this discourse that it borrowed social, scientific, and medical models to explain and ease troubled marriages. So your marriage is wrong because your sex isn't good enough, or because you're bored, or because you don't listen to your spouse enough. The new ideal attempted to combine attitudes and activities not easily reconciled. To be successful, a couple now had to combine spontaneity and calculation, this passion that's a part of love, with the ability to negotiate with a taste for hot romance, right? So I want hot romance, but I also want a spouse who will do all the dishes. And so you have this competing narrative. You have this narrative in which, well, what is love? It's a series of practices where you care for one another with this sense that you should always be excited and romantic. In another book that I've read about, the author describes a couple who hired a babysitter on their anniversary. They have lots of kids, hired a babysitter so that they could go have sexual intercourse in a truck apart from everyone else. This is the kind of sense of weird combination of passion and mundaneness that many of our undergraduates, many of our young people have learned. And of course, think about how detrimental this is early in love, right? And so if you find out that you're actually in the middle of trying to love a concrete human being and they, I don't know, are annoying or snore, as it turns out, you kind of say like, well, I'm not interested in them, this person. Where's the passion? Where's the romance? And so passion and romance is encountered in these sexual encounters that don't go into intimacy, that don't move beyond. So this philosophy of love is wrong. And so, here's an example of actually what love looks like. This is at my daughter's baptism. My son is doing his best to either love her or kill her, and we're trying to hold their children. So love is different. A philosophy of love, what constitutes love, is different. Love is not reducible either to mere feelings, right? I feel something because I love you. I feel passionate, or a series of objective rules whereby I determine whether I'm in love. Love is this mix of both the objective and the subjective, but it's an objective and subjective that's directed towards the loving of a concrete human being. In a philosopher we read in my class, Dietrich von Hildebrand, love is that which gives us sight, revealing to us even the faults of the other and their full import, and causing us to suffer because of them. But love reveals to us intuitively the whole being of the other in a mysteriously lucid unity. It not only shows us individual praiseworthy traits, but the particular charm of their individuality as a whole, which permeates everything and characterizes the essence of their being. A charm which can only be completely understood by the complementary person and can have its full significance in him alone. So in encountering this love, I encounter a person, a concrete human being. It's this person I love. A philosophy of love is to love a person who exists in all of this particularity. It's not about my own affections or desires alone. It's rather to love this person unto the end. This is the kind of philosophy of love that must ground a kind of medicine for the hookup culture. It's not just that, but we also have the kind of practice of dating. And so don't sue me, Disney. But here's an image from Lady and the Tramp. Right? Many of my, because intimacy is such a problem amongst many of my students, and because communion is such a problem, they don't even know how to go on a date. I always remember, I have my students go as a date as one of their assignments. And I always remember one of the students said, I had no idea what I was doing. He told his mother that he was going on a date, and his mother was very excited by this fact, as mothers tend to be. And he went and he actually sat in his car the entire time, and then beeped at her very quickly and said, come on down when it was time. And he told his mother this, who then properly sort of punched him upside the head and said, what are you doing? You see, Dating is a practice. Intercommunication and communion is practice. We learn to dwell with people by spending time with them, by learning to ask questions of people, asking things about their lives, sharing things in common, having the kind of conversations that matter. And so dating, actually, ironically, real dating, not drunken dating, not showing up to a bar and finding out who you end up sort of getting drunk with, but actually saying to someone, I want to take you out on a date. I want to pay. I want you to know this is a date. I'm interested in getting to know you, as a remarkable healing dimension of the hookup culture. Next, I want to say something about the nuptial kerygma. Okay, nuptial is a word that means bridal or spousal. It's related to a wedding. Kerygma is that proclamation of salvation. And many of my undergraduates are surprised to learn that at the heart of the Christian mystery as a whole is a mystery of love, a nuptial kerygma, a kerygma of love. And so I often take my students through all the scriptures, as I do actually in the book, Off the Hook, but we don't have time for that. So I just want to take you through one, and probably the one that no one likes. This is Ephesians 5, 1 through 2, 21 through 33. That reading, which if you're like me, your spouse and you sort of laugh at every time it's read at church because of sort of, in some sense, the absurdity of what's being proclaimed. But I always like to tell my students, let's look more closely at the passage to understand the nuptial kerygma. That is, if you read the Old Testament, if you read the entirety of the Old Testament, one of the things that you quickly discover is that God loves Israel. Not like abstractly loves Israel, but God describes this love for Israel as a kind of wedding love, as a romantic love, eros, desire. It's in Hosea, for example, that we hear that God has decided that despite the infidelity of Hosea, rather the infidelity of Israel, that God will dwell with Israel and will stay married to Israel. In the book of Isaiah, in the book of Jeremiah, we hear that the final transformation of the world will be a wedding feast, not just a sort of moment of gazing into each other's eyes, but a wedding feast, a celebration in which God and humanity will be forever married. And we even hear this even more in the Gospels, okay? So in the Gospel of John, the Samaritan woman at the well, her marriage takes place in some sense. She goes to a well, and it's not just any well, it's Jacob's well. This is in John 3. And so at Jacob's well, the Samaritan woman discovers, happily, that she has found a suitor. It's Christ who's come to marry her not in the sense of sort of literal marry her, but he's the bridegroom who's come for the bride. And even on the cross in the Gospel of John, from the side of Christ, just like from the side of Adam and Eve, as we hear in Genesis, or Adam in Genesis, the church comes forth in love. And so the church, Israel, and then later Christians in the church have a long history of thinking about this proclamation of what God has done in bridal imagery. That's what Paul is picking up. So he says to the Ephesians, be imitators of God as beloved children. This language, imitators of God as beloved children, means become like God. Take upon yourself exactly what God took upon himself in Christ. And as beloved children, this is a reference to kind of baptism. To be beloved children is to be an imitator of God. And walk in love as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us, a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God. So walk in love as Christ loved us. Become like this. And then only after he does this, does he then begin to sort of address these household codes about how Christians should behave. But note the very first thing he says, something that almost every person meets or misses in hearing this. Husbands and wives, be subject to one another out of reverence for Christ. Note, subjection begins in mutual subjection. But what is this subjection? It's not the subjection of power. It's not the subjection that, for example, Notre Dame subjected USC to this last weekend. That's not subjection. To be subject is to offer yourself in the entirety of love. So what Paul ends up doing is actually radically reversing the typical household codes of the time. Wives, be subject to your husbands as to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church, his body, and is himself its Savior. As the church is subject to Christ, so let wives also be subject in everything to their husbands. So yes, women at the time were not able to sort of operate without sort of their husbands. But note that Paul underlines that we are to be subject to one another out of reverence for Christ. It's a mutual subjection. And so husbands also then must be subject, in essence, to their wives through Christ. As the church is subject to Christ, so let's begin with this. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word, that he might present the church to himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that she might be holy and without blemish. Husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. Note what this means. If the husband at this time is to have power, he is not to exercise any dimension of this power through submission. It is actually only through love. And so what Paul is doing is turning upside down a competitive existence that's to relate between husband and wife. Instead, husband and wife are to love one another as Christ loved the church. And that this love, this concrete human love, this embodied love, then presents to the church an image of who she is. She is the love of Christ and the church together. That is her deepest origin. That is what guides her. That is her mission. Not power, not prestige, not fame, not fortune, but this sort of really mundane act of mutual caring love. So, of course, it doesn't mean that we're to take the scripture reading and say, okay, that means husbands are Jesus and wives are the church. That is a misreading. Rather, husbands, take upon yourself this self-giving love. Wives, love in this same self-giving way. For all of us are to love as Christ. This is actually a kind of beautiful dimension of the tradition that I think is underrepresented, is that actually it's the mystics who remind us of this, that actually can provide a huge spirituality for the couple, even preparing for marriage. That as they sort of think about their love, that actually their love is not just for themselves, but their love is to become a representation of Christ's love for the church. Here's one of my favorite lines from Hildegard of Bingen in her Scivias. When Jesus Christ, the true Son of God, hung on the tree of his passion, the church, joined to him in the secret mysteries of heaven, was dowered with his crimson blood, as she herself shows when she often approaches the altar and reclaims her wedding gift, carefully noting with what degree of devotion her children receive it when they come to the divine mysteries. So actually, even the Eucharist is to be understood as a kind of wedding gift. And so every dimension of the couple, their total capacity for self-giving love is to become reflected of the church's mission. And in this sense, it's healing of the hookup culture because we hear a kind of vision, a radical new narrative, a new story of what human love can become. It's not just a brief encounter. It's rather we're called to a more radical communion, a communion that is to reflect the love of Christ in the church. We are called to a conversion. Fourth medicine, and we're moving towards the end of our presentation, is consent. At the heart of the sacrament of marriage is the gift of consent. I, Tim, take you care to be my wife. I promise to be faithful to you. In good times and bad, in sickness and in health, I will love you and honor you all the days of my life. This is the moment of consent, the moment in which the couple pledge themselves to one another. And in pledging themselves to one another, of course, at some level, they're making a human promise. I will love you forever. But of course, who could make such a promise like this? Who could? Who could say, I will love you unto the end, you who will change and who will become a radically different kind of human being. I will love you until the day that I die. And so we give this in Christ. But the moment of the sacrament is actually that there's a new bond of love, what the church has called a sacramentum, a bond of love that unites the couple together. Their yes has forever changed what they're doing. And the moment of consent in the sacrament of marriage is not just a one-time deal. It's not like, okay, I said that once, that's it. It now becomes this bond that permanently exists between the couple as long as they both shall live. As Cardinal Willett writes in a book, Mystery and the Sacrament of Love, the mutual yes, this consent expressed verbally in the liturgy of marriage, is translated into the language of the body. That is to say, not only into the conjugal encounter. So consummation. That is, marriage is complete in the moment of consummation. You pledge yourselves, and then there is this moment of consummation. But consummation isn't it alone, lest we just understand marriage itself as a kind of excuse to have sex. Here's really one of the dangers of the hookup culture, is that if you grow up in it and you think that the point of love is sex, then even when you enter into a relationship that you might want to last forever, you come to think that the point of love is sex. And as any married couple can tell you, it isn't. Love, it actually translates itself into the spouse's shared life, their daily fidelity, their friendship, their reciprocal forgiveness, fecundity, education. Every dimension of the spouse's lives become this yes of love. This weekend, my children all came down with the stomach bug. It was not a pleasant weekend. Thanksgiving itself was ground zero for the stomach bug, and that day we cared for them. My wife got sick. As I was sort of caring for the entire family, this is the fullest expression of love. It is not at that moment just a sort of, okay, I'm carrying out love and my duties and my obligations. It certainly is that. But actually, those duties and obligations are infused and transformed through the supernatural love of Christ that infuses them. My undergraduates are just really surprised to learn that the church has this understanding of the sacrament, that it's not just a one-time deal. It actually takes over every dimension of our lives so that we consecrate the world in the most mundane of ways. The spiritual act of self-gift in the Lord, enriched by the redemptive power of Christ and the salvific action of the church, establishes the couple as a permanent sacrament and transforms its history, the couple's history, into salvation history. In other words, into a sign that bears the gift of God to his people. So we have to raise the bar about what marriage is. Marriage isn't just, okay, this is the place where you're allowed to have as much sex as possible. Rather, marriage is that moment of discipleship where you transform the created order through love. So learning about this consent is essential. And learning about the Eucharistic nature of married love. That marriage isn't just over when you end, but it actually involves going to Mass. It involves sharing in the Eucharistic life of the church and actually offering our lives back to God. In the Eucharist, offering our love back to God. In the Eucharistic preface for marriage, option B is one of my favorites. For in him, you've made a new covenant with your people, so that as you've redeemed man and woman by the mystery of Christ's death and resurrection, so in Christ you might make them partakers of divine nature, that is, that they might become divine. So in Christ you might make them heavenly partakers of divine nature and joint heirs with him of heavenly glory. In the union of husband and wife, you give a sign of Christ's loving gift of grace, so that the sacrament we celebrate might draw us back more deeply into the wondrous design of your love. Marriage is hard. In being formed in the hookup culture, you come to expect that when difficulty arises, when passion dissipates, then it's over. But the beauty of the church is that it says, actually, this mundane love, this love that is so radically mundane and normal, is the one that presents to the church an image of the Eucharist itself, an image of self-giving love, of love unto the end. Now, no couple can do this immediately. I think that's one of the things we have to work with in the hookup culture. It's an expectation for total transcendent passion that will be around forever. Listen, that doesn't happen. What happens is that life becomes normal. And it's this normal offering of life that we share with one another as we raise kids, as we offer ourselves back to God that transform us. And we go week to Mass so we can make this offering, practice this offering. This is why, to me, the most important thing to form young couples in is to get them to go to Mass regularly as a couple. Not to guilt them into it, but to say, this is how you'll learn to practice offering your joys and sorrows, everything about your life back to the Father. Lastly, medicine number 6, the domestic church. This was me on vacation this summer when it was nice. If you look out my window now, there's snow, so welcome to Indiana. The domestic church. The thing about married love and all of its gift and all of its wonder is that it results towards the family. The hookup culture forgets that children happen through sex. If you really actually think a good deal about our culture around sex, children are never involved. Even on sitcoms, notice that sometimes children come along, but that they're only there for a little bit, and then you can sort of get rid of them. That the assumption means to be, if you have sex, then that's like just about transcendent love, and children aren't part of it. The thing that's really important, I found with my undergraduates, is to introduce them right away to having children. The hookup culture is dependent upon a lack of communion, a lack of commitment, a fear of being together. And one of the things that I think is important is to reorient marriage, not to this sort of total self-consuming sacrifice of love, but oriented towards a renewed fertility, a new sharing of one's life in love, either through the birth of children, through adoption, or through the transformation of a common mission in love. As I write in the book, the family becomes an icon of the church, of the love of Christ dwelling among mortals. It does so through sustaining memory, teaching sacrifice, and bringing each person into communion. In this sense, we can think about each and every family as having a vocation drawn from the Eucharist. So the family is to sustain the memory, to be this place where Christ's love is present, to offer the sacrifice of love, and to teach communion to those around each other. I can't describe how much I've learned to love my spouse anew through loving my children. That I've actually learned that the love that I have for Kara isn't actually a sort of self-consuming, passionate love. Rather, it's the kind of love that I'm supposed to have in which we share common practices like putting the kids to bed, and common acts of discipleship like praying together and serving the hungry, like making sure that we wrap gifts and give them to the parish. It orients our, for those who are in need around Christmas. It reorients our understanding of love, not from this self-consuming, involved dimension, but to a mission, a mission to give ourselves away in total love to the world. And so, friends, the hookup culture isn't just, to summarize, isn't just about sex, pure and simple. That's always existed. It's about a radical fear of communion, of love, of something that lasts more than 15 minutes. And the gift that the church has to offer is an understanding of a love based in discipleship, in friendship, in a sacrament that bonds the couple together and transforms the couple into a sort of sacrament for the life of the world. So that's all I have, and I'm now, I think, looking forward to questions.
Thanks, Tim. Take the screen back. All right, so now's the time to ask questions. If you have questions for Tim about the presentation, or if you have anything else you want to ask about regarding the things that he discussed, feel free to do that now. You can type those to him, and we will paraphrase and relay them back to him during our Q&A session here. Tim, just real quickly, I'll start things off. Just kind of curious that, you know, I was kind of refreshing to see a presentation about marriage and sex that didn't have theology of the body. I love theology of the body, but you didn't quote directly from the catechesis. I'm just kind of curious about your take on the theology of the body and how you used it in the presentations and how you presented it to the kids as well. It was great to see saints and other people involved in the presentation, not only relying on JP2, which is what a lot of people tend to do in talking about marriage.
Yeah, so in my own book, I actually use theology of the body, I think, as a good example for a kind of philosophy of love. But you know, to me, it's very valuable, and so it helps us to sort of think about love and to understand love. I think one of the things I've discovered, especially with some of my students, is that that one of the dangers, not so much necessarily even of John Paul II, but one of the dangers, I think, of appropriators of theology of the body is that they then reduced sort of the heart of marriage to sex. It becomes the sort of ultimate moment. The worst example I've ever heard is like priests consecrate the Eucharist and married couples have sex. And I was like, that's actually not true. Priests consecrate the Eucharist and married couples receive the Eucharist. That's actually the sort of most important thing that's done. And so for me, I think it's really important. The sacrament of marriage in the history of the church, and this is what I teach my students, has never actually, or has rarely placed this act of sex at the center. If you read sort of St. Augustine, who gets a bad rap for his understanding of love, he actually describes the heart of marriage as a restoration of friendship between the couple. And so it's this restoration of friendship, of building a society of love, a culture and civilization of love. Of course, sex is going to be a part of that, but it's a part of it. It's not the sort of ultimate dimension. And so To me, actually, one of the dangers of a certain interpretation, not so much I would say of theology of the body, but a certain sort of placing sex at the center as this almost overly sacral thing. One of my fears with it is that it actually plays into the hookup culture, because then you think, okay, in marriage, I can have now as much and as exciting sex as possible. It's now legit sex. And that disappointment is going to be as ravaging on the other side as the previous version. It's going to be radically disappointing. And that actually marriage, as I tell my students, sometimes it's way better to have a glass of wine than to have sex. And that's sort of how I employ it. So yeah, it has gifts and it helps us think about love, but it's not the only thing the tradition has ever said about love and marriage.
Good.
We've got a question here from Caitlin. How do you suggest accompanying youth immersed in the hookup culture, especially those who are fearful of love?
Yeah, it's a great question. One of the things I think in the book, I have a letter to young adults that I've written, which I think actually it turns out a high school teacher used to get her students to talk about it. I think the biggest thing we have to do, especially when they're young, is to find ways to talk about it. I was talking to Jared before the webinar began, and I used to teach the course by beginning with Friedis's book, The End of Sex. And one of the things I realized is it really freaked them out because they were like, oh no, he knows what's going on in our world. And so I had to find other ways into it that was a little clearer. And so one of the things I think is really essential is to have them critique the understandings of love and romance in commercials and advertising that they find. Right? Because a lot of the hookup culture depends upon this total passionate this total passionate encounter in which mundane normal practice doesn't matter. It's Christmas time, so think about Lexus commercials where they walk in and oh, there's a bow, and oh, you love me enough to get me a Lexus. I don't love anyone enough to get them a Lexus. So, and I think we have to form our young people to recognize, man, this is really not the way to do it. The way to form young couples or even young adults is to say, like, is that love? Do you think love is like that? The other thing is, I think, mentorship. Is young couples need to be around normal young couples who engage in normal life. I finished with the domestic church section. And one of the things I think is really essential is to take young people and let them hang around families while they put their kids to bed. Instead of sort of imagining the romantic home as like this exhilarating place of total passionate love, they'll discover that there's a lot of throwing things and a lot of yelling and a lot of actually joy, but incredibly messy joy. And so I think that's one of the ways I found accompanying. We have to have the really serious conversations. If you open yourself up to the conversations, they'll have them with you. I can't describe how many undergraduates have come to my office to say, I'm hooking up and I really like the girl and I don't want to anymore. What do I do? And those are the kind of ways that you end up sort of talking to them about this, and they become open to coming to you again.
Thanks. So we're definitely full believers here about the idea of mentors and mentor couples and their influence in marriage. We had couples over last night and definitely saw and witnessed the bedtime during our meeting, which is, very, very real. Lori asked a question, and I, being involved in religious education, just curious as well about your thoughts on presenting these contrasting relationships, contrasting images of relationships. She says, hook up versus, off the hook. At what age do you think it's helpful maybe to start presenting these kinds of things to young people in terms of religious education?
Yeah, it's a great point. I think it's totally possible to start introducing it a little bit younger than we typically think. I think by the time we're talking about middle school, you should have encountered the kind of advertising that's seeking to sort of influence you in this particular way. And so religious education, by the time you're in middle school, these kind of conversations are important. When my wife was a youth minister, we found that students began to engage in oral sexual activities by the time that they were in 7th and 8th grade. And so this is not an unusual time to begin having these conversations. I think you could start younger. And I think you start younger, not obviously talking about sex, and not even necessarily talking about the sort of full nuptial imagery of the scriptures. Although I think you can set the stage for it by getting used to speaking about Jesus as the bridegroom and the church as the bride. I think one of the ways that you can do this is by families sort of modeling this sort of representative of gift from the very beginning. And so the way that parents interact with each other is already a kind of encounter. And so I know that's not religious education pure and simple in a classroom setting, but it is actually the first moment where children learn the art of love, as they're learning it from their parents. And so it's really important to form parents around their kids who love in this really more normal, mundane way, who show a kind of possibility of love. So that's part of the religious education. But in my assessment, if you're not starting to do it by 6th, 7th grade, you're too late. They're going to be catechized by something. And to be honest, advertising is much more effective often in catechesis than the church is. And so they will get the message, even if they're basically stranded on a desert island somewhere. Someone will fly a banner over.
Mary asks, how do you think parishes could help young people keep on the right path?
Yeah, I think part of this is well, young people is, of course, a big group. So I think really successful youth ministries need to talk about this regularly and involve apprenticeship into love from the very beginning. I think when we're working with young adults, we can start to have pretty serious conversations with them early on in the context of dating and relationships. I think we probably need to help young people meet each other. If you think about the primary ways that Catholics have to meet each other right now today, Catholic Match, which sometimes, as I write in the book, can be its own version of a hookup culture, right? Like when you first meet someone, probably asking them, like, so what's your view on predestination, is as scary and intimidating as meeting someone who wants to have sex with you right away. And so we really need to sort of help form friendships between young adults. And to meet each other and to say, hey, I actually think you'd be great with this person. Why don't you come over to our house and meet each other? I think we need more yentas in Catholicism, places, people who are sort of setting couples up. And young couples, I think, need help. I would say that one of the things that really lacks in the church is any sort of serious account of post-marriage formation that emerges. And I think a lot of couples, like my wife and I, went through problems where you're like, oh man, this is not exactly what we expected out of our life. Even if our relationship was good, our life wasn't. And I think providing people a sense that actually this love really matters. We think about the parish really as a kind of open household. We should know things about each other. We should know about the young couples who are gotten married. We should have them over. We should find out if they're struggling. Because as I said, the effect of the hookup isn't just a reluctance to get married at all. The effect of the hookup is that a lot of people who get married discover right away that the passion disappeared, the love disappeared, and that the only thing that remains is like the mundane everyday. And they need a sort of narrative and people to accompany them in the midst of this.
I like what you said about marriage and the mundane and just those everyday activities and helping those be a big part of the medicine, the domestic church. So thank you for sharing that. We have a question about maybe just your interpretation on why there's so much focus on sex in popular culture. Any idea what the theological or psychological underpinnings or issues are that have made premarital sex so much a part of our culture? It's kind of a big question, I guess, but any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, the advertising part is actually fairly easy, and it's not for any sort of more nefarious reason than that advertising works on desire. And as human beings, we have two desires that are most sort of at our roots. These are the most easily appealed to desires: food and sex. We have sex and we eat food. And so if you look at sort of advertising, it relies on seduction as a way of sort of selling products. And often the advertising has nothing to do with the product. I always remember in the Super Bowl, there was this Carl's Jr. Hardee's commercial in which a sort of a bikini model basically ate a burger as she undressed herself. This commercial wasn't saying go out and have sex, pure and simple. It was saying, hey, look at this sexy model. She eats burgers. Oh man, burgers are tasty. I want a burger. It's called seduction and misdirection. And so a good deal of our advertising is dependent upon this. I do think that there's some other dimension to this, is that we are at a stage of institutional decline, politically, certainly, as we all just experienced, but also with the church, socially. No one trusts any particular institution. And so with the decline of the institution of marriage, there's been a rise of the desire just for sex, of passion, that true love doesn't take place under sort of any normal setting except sort of sexual intercourse. Sexual intercourse becomes the paradigmatic expression of love because it becomes the paradigmatic expression of passion. And in that sense, that's part of the problem, is that we've so equated love and passion and sex that that's what people think falling in love is. Instead of saying like, oh, I cared for you. I was there when you were vomiting in the middle of the day. I always remember I knew my wife loved me when she was with me when I had a stomach bug. That was when I knew she loved me. It had nothing to do about what she wore or anything. She actually stayed with me and forcibly fed me ice chips every 10 minutes to keep me alive. This is the kind of dimension of love. And so I'd say that those two sort of dimensions are why sex is so essential. It sells, it works, but even more than it's selling or working, it's also part of this sort of reduction of love to passion.
And if you're looking for one, you got
Go
one.
ahead.
Yeah, there's lots of good questions coming in. There's lots of people are very thoughtful with their questions and comments, and I really appreciate that. Everyone who's jumping in. There's a few people that are clearly working with youth at the teen level, and you mentioned the statistically the breakdown with pornography as a problem that was a good, I think, concrete way of thinking about pornography statistically in college level. It's certainly a big problem with high school teens as well. What have you found to be most effective in kind of addressing that head on with people who might be struggling with that or aware of it, or that are in class, or any thoughts on that for the youth minister that might be attending this webinar?
Yeah, it's really hard. It produces so much guilt. There's an awareness that it's insufficient, but there's also a recognition of a kind of radical need for it. And so, there's like almost an addiction. One of the things I think is that it has to be just talked about. We've found, I think, on our own campus that one of the effective ways of doing it is by having sort of public discussions of those who perhaps have been addicted but are no longer addicted for pornography and what was done, for having support groups and small group discussion, and to often sort of make yourself available to have these conversations with folks as they move along. These porn companies are very effective advertisers. The internet is a deadly space, basically, for pornography. And I've had students who I know were targeted by the time they were 11 or 12 years old based upon what they were watching or sort of looking at on the internet. They weren't looking for porn. They were looking for what 11 or 12-year-old boys might be looking for on the internet, and funny YouTube videos. And the first thing that sort of ends up happening is that they get sort of pushed porn, and because the advertising relies upon it. And so, I think one of the things we really have to be serious about is to have a conversation about habits and asceticism around pornography, help, and addiction, and what happens when we watch it, and what kind of view of sex it looks for, and what is it presenting, and what is it meaning. The other thing is, I think porn always meets a deeper need. Almost every undergraduate I've ever talked to says at the end of watching porn, they felt empty. And yet they will look at it again and again. And I think one of the things is, one of the reasons I think we're so addicted to pornography is this fear of communion, right? What's the easiest sex you can have with someone? Sex with yourself. Sex alone in front of a screen. And so that's the kind of sex that doesn't come with any strings attached. It doesn't come with, the other person isn't there on the other side saying like, okay, what are we going to do for the rest of the day? All that you have is the sort of moment of orgasm. And so I think that's really the effect. And so it's often a result of loneliness, of fear. I also think, we have to speak out against the pornographic culture. So we have to sort of, say something against it, and even for the entire industry. So, it really is an industry that's dreadful. At our own university, for example, I'm very proud of our students who've asked that pornography be banned from the internet sites on campus. That's the kind of thing we need to have public conversations as the church. We find a lot of partners in the secular sphere around that too. So maybe have your high school students, do a session on pornography, what it is, what it does, but then at the end have them do something like write to their local congressman to ask for banning of pornography in sort of public places or sort of public internet, or write schools to determine if making sure that the internet has sort of banned pornographic internet options.
That really provides the support and the accountability that people need, to fight this addiction.
Yeah, and put a lock on your computer. I always say, give your friend, get a porn sort of security lock and give it to a person whom you trust, and you don't know it, and only they can unlock your computer for these sites. And so I'm in favor of such public and friendship and accountability, right? Isn't that in the end what fraternal correction's about?
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
Good. Aaron, any of those you want to jump in on the questions? There's lots of people are saying, here to a lot of what you're saying, and not questions so much as just saying thank you, Tim, for your time and for your insights today.
Yeah, one of the things that I've really taken away is that we tend to, I think, set people up for failure in regards to marriage because we idealize it, and you talk about really revealing the mundane, although good, but the mundane aspects of marriage, which I appreciate hearing today.
Yeah, it does build passion, though. I mean, that's, I think, the source of our passion in the end is the mundane. It's precisely the love over a long-term history of 35 to 40 years of someone, of being there with them.
Absolutely.
Well, Tim's mentioned a couple times the book Off the Hook that I know he used as a basis for a lot of what he presented today. And so if you're interested in getting that book, a copy of that book, it's here's a discount code, webinar 1127, and that's 20% off that book, and it expires next week if you want to take advantage of that. So go ahead and do that very soon. Anything else about the book, Tim, and your experience with it so far?
No, I mean, I'm grateful that people are reading it. It like I said, it's always an honor to talk about things that you think about with people who can change the church and the world. So and I'm grateful that Ave published it, but also gave me this opportunity here today.
Well, it's doing very well, and we're grateful to have it in the house as well. So thank you.
So before we sign off, we'd like to thank our partners once again, the National Conference for Catechetical Leadership, the National Association of Catholic Family Life Ministers, the National Association for Lay Ministry, and the National Federation of Priests' Councils. If you're not familiar with any of these organizations, feel free to check them out on their websites.
And just real quickly, we have a recording of this webinar as well as the past webinars from the many years of this series at avemariapress.com/webinar-videos, and also available at our YouTube channel and Vimeo channels at youtube.com/avemariapress.
And please mark your calendars for the next webinar in the Professional Development Series on Tuesday, December 18th at 3 o'clock. Notre Dame professor Leonard DiLorenzo will reflect on what we can learn in Scripture from St. Joseph, who was a model of what it means to wait for the Lord. This walk through Scripture will be personally enriching and pastorally relevant to ministry leaders during this season of Advent. You can go to avemariapress.com/webinars to sign up.
Okay, well, thanks everybody, and thank you, Tim, so much for your time today.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.